Bishops are better than knights, right? Well, sometimes. They're particularly good when the board is pretty open, there aren't a lot of other pawns or pieces to block them. And so you would think in an endgame where one side has a bishop and the other side has a knight and a single pawn, the bishop should be able to draw that endgame pretty easily, right? Should be able to prevent the pawn from promoting. Well, it depends. And actually, knights can be pretty tricky, and a knowledgeable player with a knight and a pawn can actually manage to win that endgame in certain scenarios. So let's dive in and have a look at how this endgame works. So this is a pretty basic opening position for, not opening position, but pretty basic position for this endgame to kind of demonstrate the key ideas. So, of course, the side with the pawn is going to want to try to promote that pawn. And the thing with a bishop, obviously, is it can only attack squares that are of the same color as that bishop. So in this position, the bishop has to prevent this pawn from moving past the e2 square, because that is a light square, right? And the other interesting thing is white has insufficient material to actually checkmate black. And so white is only playing for a draw. And if this pawn were to push at any point here, then the bishop can just capture. Like, so for example, if black were to play this and white were just to wait and black pushes the pawn, now white can just trade and it's a draw. It's a draw by insufficient material. And so that is the kind of thing that white is going for. So let me just back up. Is it hopeless for black only having this one little knight in order to try to win this game? Well, not necessarily. There is one way that black can manage to win. So if the king moves over here, and let's say white just isn't quite sure and feels like, oh, my bishop is just going to be, is going to be powerful and is going to defend the game for me. They're just leaving it on this diagonal. Well, that is actually a blunder. And the reason is because the knight can block the bishop. And so now if the bishop takes the knight, then of course this is a winning king and pawn endgame. And the bishop is too slow to get over onto the other diagonal because the pawn is just going to move right past that light square and promote into a queen. So the defending side has to be careful of this sort of blockading move. So back here, instead, the correct move, there are a few correct moves that work, but one of them is this, bishop e2. And that means that the knight coming to d3 doesn't actually work because the bishop can just hang out on this other diagonal and block the pawn from the other direction. And so now there's basically nothing that black can do. Of course, I can try for a blockade in the other direction, but white can just keep moving from one diagonal to the other. And theoretically, there's nothing that black can do to actually stop this. But there are some more complicated cases. So one of the more complicated cases is, I guess I should say it this way. If the defending bishop has two diagonals that are both more than 4 squares, then the defender should always be able to draw this game. However, if one of the diagonals is only 4 squares, then technically there is a way for the side with the knight to win. And this is a bit of a contrived case, but in this case, black can win. And how they do that is by bringing their king around here. And what this does is it covers 2 of the squares in that 4 squared diagonal. And then the knight goes here. And now the knight and the king are fully controlling that defending diagonal that the bishop is on. And so the bishop is going to have to move off the diagonal or be captured, and the pawn is going to make it through that dark squared blockade. So this is easier said than done. when there are 4 squares in the diagonal, if the king manages to get closer, I'll show you this example as well. So this is the exact same. Let me just show you. If we go back to the beginning of this position, but all we change is instead of the white king being over here, the white king is here instead, then this is a draw. And the reason is, like, black could still do the exact same thing, bring the king down here, but then they can't put the knight here. And this king is too close. If they try to kind of maneuver around so that this king is covering these squares and the knight ends up here, this king is close enough that it can just defend everything. So having a 4-square diagonal means that in some cases, theoretically, there's still a win available because the bishop can be driven off, but it's easier said than done. If that diagonal is less than 4 squares, if it's 3 or 2, then it's much easier for the attacking side to drive the bishop off of that diagonal and get the win. So here's a more complex one, which is interesting. So this is a win, but it's a difficult win. So the king is in check, of course, so the king has to move. And now the king, it's nice, the king is in this position where these 2 squares are both being blockaded, and the knight has to get here. And the knight can get there in 1, 2, 3 moves, right? But there's a problem. 1, 2, 3. In 3 moves, the king can also get there. And so if black just isn't paying attention, the king can start to come in, and then, like, let's say we just say, all right, we're gonna take this path. This is a blunder. I'll show you why in a minute. The king comes, and the king gets there just in time, and it's an equal position because black, well, if black puts the knight there, it's just going to be captured, and now it is a draw. So there is a move to win this game, but there's only one move. There's a single move. If you're interested, pause the video for just a second here and see if you can find the correct move in order to win this game for black. So after you've given that a try yourself, here's the move. It is knight b5. That's the only move that wins in this position. And the reason is because then if white just continues bringing their king, now the black knight goes to d4. And in this position, the knight is both aiming to go to f5, but also blocking the king from getting any closer. And this is simply a win for black. So white just, makes a move like that. Black puts the knight on f5, and now the bishop is driven off of the diagonal, and the pawn is going to promote. So it's a pretty tricky endgame, and it has a lot to do with whether the defending king is close enough to prevent this sort of setup to drive that bishop off the diagonal with 4 squares. Again, if it's less than 4 squares, then it becomes even easier for the attacking side. As with many endgames, there are exceptions when it's a rook's pawn, when there's a pawn on the edge of the board. So generally, if this king is close enough, then there can be a draw. And there's kind of just an interesting little trick to this. So first of all, if the knight and the bishop weren't on the board and this pawn was on the 7th rank, or the 2nd rank in this case, there's an end game where if this king is in front of the pawn, the defending king can just bounce back and forth between these 2 squares and can block this king in front of the pawn. And there's something similar that can happen here. So first of all, we attack that pawn because, again, white is perfectly happy to trade off the bishop for this pawn, right? And then white gets the draw that they want. And so we force the pawn to be pushed here. We check the king. And now we put the bishop in the corner, bishop h1. And this is fascinating because it looks like we're just sacrificing a bishop for absolutely no reason. But we're blocking the pawn. The pawn can't move. And when the king captures the bishop, we actually have this move, king f2. But the interesting thing is, king f2 works, king f1 doesn't. Why would that be the case? Well, the reason is, if we go king f1, then the knight can go here. And then again, like I said, we're just going to bounce back and forth here. So this king can never get out of the way of the pawn. But now the knight can go here on g3. And the thing that g3 does, so first of all, if you just take the knight, then the king gets out and the pawn is going to promote. But the knight also blocks the king from going to f1, which is the other square that blocks in this king. So back in this position, how do you know which of these squares to go to in order for the knight not to be able to, prevent you from getting to the other one? And the trick is you have to go to the square that is the same color as the knight. And the reason is in this position, the king can't move, the pawn can't move, only the knight can move, right? And the thing is, the knight always switches colors on every move, right? It can't make a move where it stays on the same color. And so the king also wants to be switching colors every move. And so when the knight moves in this position, it can be attacking the dark squares. So we both started on dark squares. So now the knight is going to move to a light square. We're going to move to a light square. The knight's going to move to a dark square, which may attack the king, but then we can move to a dark square. And again, the knight can move to a light square. We can move to a light square. And the knight can never prevent us from going from to the square we want, because it can only ever attack the square we're on. It can never attack the square that we want to go to when we start on the same color as the knight. It's kind of fascinating. It's a very interesting thing, and something that, I don't know, during game, if you didn't know it, you might just play king f1, right? Like it hardly seems like there's very much of a difference. But it's a pretty interesting thing for when you're in this kind of position with a rook's pawn. And I'll just show another interesting line, because there are some very interesting sort of tactical lines in this kind of position that can be really complicated. And so in this position, for example, even though the king is pretty close, black can win. And black can win because there's just this wild line that just, I don't know, I don't think I'd be able to find it in a game, to be honest, but let me show it to you. The knight goes here, and this makes sense. The knight is threatening to blockade the bishop, right? So the bishop can get in the way. And then the knight goes here anyway. And there are several different lines. I'm not going to go through all of the different variations, but let's say the king just stays on e1. So the king wants to be able to come in to one of these two squares when the black king goes to grab this bishop, right? But then black moves the knight out to a4. And this gives the knight a bit of flexibility. It allows the knight to jump back at some point. The knight may be able to wrap around and target that bishop, and sometimes that will even prevent this king from taking this square, because that would be a fork from here and here, right? So now let's say the white king just wants to stay flexible. Now in this particular line, black actually can't just go after the bishop right away, because if they go after the bishop right away, the king can follow along. And if they take, now the king can get to the blockading square that is the same color as the knight. This is a draw, as we've just seen. But if we move back to here, what the king can do is go down to c1, and then it kind of forces this king to go onto a less flexible square. So e1 is maybe the most stubborn approach, but let's just look at what happens if the king goes to d3. Now, the black king can go after the bishop, because if this king goes here, then we have this interesting move, knight b2. And this is basically a Zugzwang position, and we're going to analyze it a little bit closer in a minute, because there's another variation. As I mentioned, the king would probably go to e1 instead. There's another variation here that ends up in this same position, but this, just trust me for a second, this is winning for black. And so if the king goes to e1 instead of going up to d3, now what we do is this crazy knight c5, and this, so if the king goes to e2, then now we can actually go after the bishop again, and the king can't go to this square, because if the king goes to this square, then there's this fork that I mentioned. And that's why putting the knight here and allowing for this is just an interesting, flexible kind of decision. So instead, what about king d1, right? Because now the king has access to both of these squares. Well, now we go knight d3, and the king moves up, still trying to stay on those two squares, and we get back to this position, which was the same one that we just looked at a minute ago. This is winning for black, and the reason it's winning for black, so first of all, if black just takes with the bishop, then it's easily winning. But now white has to move, and where can the king go? So the king can't actually go here. That's kind of the whole point. The king can't go here, which would be the square that gives it the most flexibility. So it either has to move away. Whoops. Oh my heavens. It has to move away from these two squares, or it has to move up here. But now it can't get down to this square. So So if we take the bishop, now in order for the king to block us from getting out, the king only has one option, this one. But it is the opposite color of the knight, and this is a win for black if they're on opposite colors. And so you can see just very easily the knight goes here, which is covering that square. King takes, king moves up, and we're going to promote just like that. And so this is a really tricky endgame. I just showed you this last one just for kind of a sense of how complicated it can get, because it's not simple. And especially with the rook's pawn, there are different ideas. I think this idea of, you know, trying to block in the other king on the square that is the same color as the knight is a pretty interesting one that could certainly come up in games and in this kind of endgame. But yeah, it's a pretty complicated thing, but definitely worth kind of having in your toolbox and knowing about. So yeah, hopefully these ideas are helpful for you, and thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, definitely hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more like this. And if you're interested in another Endgames video, let me just switch back here. If you're interested in another Endgames video, I have one right over here, which is same colored bishops. So each side has one bishop, and one side has a pawn. And this is a pretty interesting endgame to take a look at as well. I will see you on the next one.